Tzaharaim Tovim. This week we're going to be discussing Parshat BeHar. I've entitled this, Our Land Needs Shabbat Too. This year, as we go through our Torah readings, as we already know, we do not generally have double Parshiot. It's a leap year. So we get to focus a little bit more on less text as we go along. We've already seen this with Acharei Kadoshim, and now we're going to see this again with BeHar B'chukotai. So this week is BeHar's chance to shine. We begin with Vayikra chapter 25, verses 1 through 6. And God speaks to Moshe on Mount Sinai, saying, Daber B'nai Yisrael v'amata alehen ki tavo el haaretz asher ani noten lachem v'shavta haaretz Shabbat ladoshem. Speak to the children of Israel, and you will say to them, you will come to the land that I am giving you, v'shavta haaretz Shabbat, and the land shall rest for a Shabbat to God. God rests. People are to rest. All the members of one's household and one's land are to rest, as we learn. The servants, the animals, every element that is part of the composition of the land-based community. And now we are told that it is ordained by God, and in terms of the pitch of this particular parsha, the land is to rest as well. Shesh shanim tizra sadecha, v'shesh shanim tizmor karmecha. For 6 years you will sow the land, for 6 years you will prune your vineyard, you will gather its produce. Uveshana shvi'it, and in the sabbatical year, Shabbat Shabbaton. It shall be a Sabbath of complete rest for the land, Shabbat ladoshem. And this phrase is repeated. It is a Shabbat to God. God is ordaining that the land must rest. You will not sow your field. You will not prune your vineyard. You should not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest and the produce of the Shabbat of the land, because there will continue to be growth. Will be yours to eat for you, for your male and female slaves, your hired worker, and the residents who lives with you. This is about everyone. Landowners, their families, their servants, for whom they have responsibilities, the animals, and yes, the land. Not only because it's their land, in fact, it is not their land, but because it is the land provided for them by God. And this is the instruction manual for how one observes this. At the beginning of the parasha, Rashi deals with the famous question, what does Shemitah have to do with Har Sinai? Weren't all the commandments given on Har Sinai? Because that's how we begin. Remember the little mountain that could? That's where we get all these commandments. So we name our Parsha BeHar on the mountain. And here we're talking about Shemitah. So what relevance, asks Rashi, does the subject of Shemitah, the rest and the release of the fields in the 7th year, have to do with Har Sinai? Weren't all the commandments stated from Har Sinai? What we're learning here is that the general principles and its finer details were all in fact stated from Sinai, and their general principles as well were stated. Why is Shemitah used as an example to prove this rule, especially since all the fine details of Shemitah are not necessarily stated here? So Rashi claims that while in Devarim we will review all the fine details of so many things, we will not do that so much in terms of the laws of Shemitah. So that they are here, they are standing there, they're ready to go into the land. And if you think about it, it makes a great deal of sense. But because before we can talk about our relationships with each other and our interactions in our daily lives, we have to know that we can support ourselves. And remember, this is BGS before grocery stores, which take everything from the land to begin with. And everything had to be gotten directly from the land. So let's establish how we address the land fulfilling our needs before we go to other factors and other aspects of our relationship. Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz teaches as follows regarding our Parsha and its laws of Shemitah. Perhaps no more than a curious practice in ancient times to many, but Rabbi Steinsaltz, alav shalom, teaches us that it's actually much more. And this is what he says. The answer that Rashi gives us is very surprising and not entirely sufficient. Just as the laws of Shemitah were revealed at Har Sinai with all their general principles and details, all of the mitzvot were. So what's the point? This answer explains what Har Sinai has to do with Shemitah. But, says Rav Steinsaltz, Zichrono L'Shalom, not what Shemitah has to do with Har Sinai. According to Rashi, Har Sinai had to be mentioned here in order to teach us that even though Shemitah is already mentioned elsewhere in the Torah, all of its principles and details were revealed at Har Sinai, and the same will apply to all the other mitzvot, as we shall see. Yet even if this mitzvah becomes the paradigm for how all the other mitzvot and their details are explained, the question still remains, why was this the mitzvah that is specifically chosen to be mentioned in connection with Har Sinai? The whole subject of Shabbat ha'aretz, the Shabbat of the land, the Shemitah, and the Yovel, the Jubilee year, is known to be very important in the Torah, of far more importance than it is ascribed to it nowadays. And one of the proofs for this is in the next Parsha. Toward the end of the Tochacha, in Vayikra Chaf Vav, it says, then the land will enjoy its Shabbatot. As long as it's desolate, it will enjoy the sabbatical rest that you will give it while you are not living on it. The implication is that the great Tochacha, the list of all the things we should not do and that we should do, refers specifically to not sidestepping or ignoring the laws of the Shemitah and the Yovel year. In the Haftarah, where Jeremiah discusses why the land was destroyed, what emerges is that God overlooks the ultimate severity, not the wrongdoing, but the ultimate ramifications of severity of various forbidden sexual relationships, idolatry, and bloodshed, but will never overlook the neglect of Torah. It is in our portions as well that a similar idea emerges in these parshiot. The implication here is that God was establishing the primacy of the very laws that might have been sidestepped, namely those of Shemitah. God is willing to forgive and perhaps provide a reset for everything. But ultimately, what creates the greatest destruction foretold in the Tochacha is the disregard of the laws of Shemitah. In the Mishnah's list of sins of Averot deemed responsible for punishment coming into the world as well, it can be observed that neglecting the laws of Shemitah occupies a central place. I'm now going to share from our Haftarah, which is going to amplify some of these ideas. Yirmiyahu says, the word of God came to me saying, Hananel, the son of Shalom, your uncle, is coming to you. Buy for yourself my field that is in Anatot. The right of redemption is yours to buy it. So first of all, we're acquiring land. Now, what's interesting here is the right of purchase is established. We've seen this. It goes all the way back to Abraham in the Marat HaMachpelah. But its rules and regulations are to be followed. Not ownership with rights only, and not just responsibility, but one must be accompanied by the other. I don't know if y'all remember, but when condominiums became a thing, there was this notion that joint ownership of area had its positive notes, its blessings. It's, I'm not required to clean my sidewalk from snow. I'm not required to take care of certain public areas that I am able to enjoy. And it also came with responsibilities. So the two created this notion of shared space. If you go back into the laws and the development of the various elements of, for example, Shabbat and carrying in a Reshut Rabim in public area versus private area, when people lived in communities where they lived in very small areas, but the chatzer, the yard in the middle, was jointly owned, there were responsibilities. So that's what we're seeing here with the right of purchase. Anyone who's a homeowner, you are responsible for your land. You have to pay for your utilities and so on. There is responsibility as well as privilege here. Hananel, my uncle's son, continuing our Haftarah, then comes to me and says, buy me the field that is in Anatot, that's in the country of Binyamin. The right of inheritance is yours, and you have the right of redemption. Buy it for yourself. So we see this notion as well, redemption of and holding on to ancestral lands. Interestingly enough, that has created a lot of contention. This notion of ancestral lands is something that is, for example, very, very well known in Middle Eastern culture. Maybe not so much here. Those of us that are living in homes that were owned by our parents, by our grandparents, by our great-grandparents, by our great-great-grandparents are very, very few and far between. But in many cultures, having the key to one's great-grandfather's house establishes a sense of ownership and a sense of connection between that person and the land. And then when you have multiple people who feel that connection to that land, we have a lot of the conflicts that we're seeing in our world today. So it goes on, and it says that the field was bought from Hanamel, and this is the money that was given. So just for fun, just notice the many different aspects of this transaction of land, buying the land, proper contract, exchange of money, maintaining familial and ancestral lands, and so on. It goes on, and it says the bill of sale was written and took the deed of purchase according to the laws and the conditions. I took the sale document with the signature, mitzvah, and by all the laws and the conditions that were open. In other words, it's an open contract. Everyone can see it. It's known what the conditions of that contract are. And it goes on and completes the transaction. Then says God in verse 14 of our Haftarah, the Lord of hosts, God of Israel, take these scrolls, the deeds of purchase, the signed one and the open scroll, and put them into an earthen vessel so that they may remain for many years. Interestingly enough, any of us who have been to various museums that are chronicling for us the purchase or the ownership of lands by different groups often will see in these displays earthen vessels in which documents are found, and many times those documents are deeds for land. That was their safety deposit box. Put it in an earthenware vessel that will not disintegrate, that will maintain it, so that you can know that it's in safe keeping. So think about the concept behind this of the love of land, the feeling of connection to the land, and the seriousness with which that connection is felt. And then God, the Lord of hosts, says, houses and fields and vineyards will be purchased again in this land. In other words, this land, it's Yirmiyahu, we're in the exile, they will come back and they will be all able to reclaim these ancestral lands for them. Then it's very interesting, verse 17. What does it say? Ata Hashem Elokim hine ata asita et hashamayim ve'et haaretz b'kochacha hagadol b'Yisrael hanetuya lo yipalei mimcha kol davar. After this whole discussion of the deed of purchase and protecting it and the land and the use of the land, we read, and you, God, You have made the heaven and the earth by your great power and your outstretched arm, and nothing is hidden from you. How does this appear in the middle of this discussion? And then goes on, who exercises loving kindness to thousands and requires the proper behavior or repays the wrongdoing of the fathers for children who follow them. Great and mighty God, Lord of hosts, is God's name. God is great in counsel and carrying it out. Your eyes are open to all the ways of mankind, to give everyone in accordance to their ways and in accordance to the fruit of their deeds. Why do we slip into this praising of God in the middle of this very specific, or may I even use the word technical, discussion? Because our relationship to the land begins with God. God created the land before us, before the human being. And God gave the charge to the human beings. And in terms of this specific relationship of God and Israel and the Jews, this land, we then go on and we say, you brought your people Israel forth out of the land of Egypt with signs, with wonders, and with a strong hand, with an outstretched arm. You gave this land which you swore to their fathers, to give them a land, Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash, flowing with milk and honey. We often speak of this threefold connection between God, the people of Israel, and the land of Israel. This is not just words. This is not about politics, but in our world today, when so much about being Jewish and being connected to Israel is being threatened and questioned and maligned and all of those things out there, as one friend of mine said, people do not understand that Israel is part of our identity as Jews. Do we have to negotiate what that means in our world? Do we have to do it in a way that somehow is going to make sense? I mean, we're in a horrible place right now, but you cannot negate that connection. We were brought out of Egypt to be the people we are. We were given this land to live as the people that we are supposed to be, and we have to protect the land. It has to have its Shabbat. It has to have all that it needs from us, as well as what we need from it. We often speak of this threefold connection between God, the people of Israel, and the land of Israel. This is not just words. And in this parsha, we see our need to take care of all that we have, including the land that we have the privilege to work and serve. We are reminded about our role towards this land twice in the beginning of Bereshit, in the very beginning of our Torah cycle, where we say, Vayomer Elokim na'aseh adam b'tzalmo kipotenu v'yardu b'dugat ha'am u'ba'of ha'shamayim u'behema b'chol ha'aretz u'b'chol ha'remet aromet al ha'aretz. In chapter 1, verse 26 of Bereshit, God says, let us make man, the human being, the earthling, in our image, after our likeness, and they shall rule, have dominion, supervise over the fish, over the fowl, over the animals, over the entire earth and everything on it. And then a little bit later in chapter 2 we read, Vayikach Hashem Elokim et ha'adam v'yanechehu b'gan Eden la'avda u'l'shomra. And God took the human being, the earthling, put that earthling in the Garden of Eden to work it and to guard it. So how can we hold both truths? Vayirdu, you shall rule the land. Many dominate over it. Yardu, yored, to push down. And now we're reading la'avda u'l'shamra, to work and to guard it. It's both. You cannot supervise, you cannot maintain, you cannot rule if it's not for the purpose of guarding and working it. You have to earn the right to have that dominance, to have that rulership over the land. Further, we often understand that we are reading two parallel understandings of the creation of the world. The first chapter of Bereshit is God's perspective. Vayomer Hashem, Vayomer Hashem, Vayomer Hashem, every verse. The total gestalt, if you will. But in Perek Bet, we get more of the totality view from the human perspective, clarifying our role. Yes, we're to rule over the land, but according to God's plan, with humility, with gratitude, not the human perspective too often filled with hubris. As we read in chapter 2, verse 15, La'avda u'l'shamra puts this in perspective. Here we are to understand the tone and the purpose of this parsha, which commands us to observe the Shabbat for the land, to be as serious about allowing the land to rest and all that that entails as we are to rest for ourselves. We continue to learn from Rav Steinsaltz. He says, while a farmer's perception of Shemitah is obviously different from that of the average Israeli, the difficulty of observing the laws of Shemitah is much lower today than in the past. At the very most, it becomes one of the many nuisances that an observant Jew must deal with, another annoying, in quotes, halacha. Just as one must be sure to eat kosher food, just as living in the land includes observing the laws of Truma and Maser, Shemitah is now added to the list. However, these halachot have long ago ceased to make much of a practical difference, even for farmers. It's of the land, so people create gardens that are not on the land and can grow. Or there are bills of sale that one can use. And I don't know what's going on now in terms of Israel's reality, but it would often be that Israeli farmers could sell some of their land to Arab workers, and then somehow there were various arrangements that were made. There's all kinds of various ways to address this. Also, things don't have to be, that are not grown in Israel, don't need the Shemitah year. Many different things. Steinsaltz continues. The concept of sabbatical, not just as a weekly day of rest, but also as a legal regulation that entitles people to a year's vacation from their jobs, is becoming increasingly established all over the world. How can the economy survive this phenomenon? The answer is that the industrialized world lives on a tremendous surplus, and with it, a tremendous amount of waste. We see hunger in our world. We see mismanagement of resources. We see inequitable distribution. We are told that given the position of the world today, there should not be hunger in our world. There should not be a child that does not have enough food. We can provide all these things, but because of inequitable distribution and hubris and saying, I own the land, I own all of this, we are not sharing as we should share. And all through the Torah we see the payah, you leave the corners, you leave that shechacha that you forgot, you leave that drops, you leave all these things for people to come and support themselves by procuring food for themselves. We will see this in the story of Ruth during Shavuot. We continue to learn a bit from Rabbi Steinsaltz. Modern society is based on the production of services, and most people in modern society engage in production of services, not of goods. This changes people's relationship to the land and their dependence on it, and this change has lessened the perceived existential significance of keeping the laws of Shemitah. It appears that the whole idea of Shemitah has another meaning, one that can be more relevant in our generation's reality. It is this meaning that is emphasized in this parsha as well, teaches Rabbi Steinsaltz. This emphasis is not connected with God demanding of us a great sacrifice. Rather, the emphasis is on who owns the land. In the Shemitah year, and even more so in the Yovel, in the Jubilee year, there's an aspect of suspension of property ownership by a kind of royal decree from the heavens. Our sages call it a fakta d'malka, a royal suspension. God proclaims that God is suspending ownership of all land, all property, and canceling all debts. Such a suspension, according to Rabbi Steinsaltz, is not an anomalous idea. Ever since Greek and Roman times, and in other countries and other times as well, instances of this kind of decree have occurred. In the past, some countries instituted such a decree when they sensed that the economic situation was volatile. Imagine for a moment if we could say, Adgan, until this point, you can own whatever, or, and we attempt to do this by tax structures that are supposed to ask more of the wealthy. But then, of course, we see in our world today that too many of our wealthy folks are sidestepping this, are finding ways around it, are justifying doing so, and grabbing more and more and more and more. And this is what is creating the problems that we have in terms of inequitable distribution. It's not that there's not enough for the people of the world. It's that the land grabbers and the material grabbers are keeping things away from others. Finally, to continue Rabbi Steinsaltz's point, when people sensed that the pressures, the inequity, or the exploitation of a certain class had reached the point of being unbearable, the country would simply announce that it would stop paying its debts, and creditors would now have to write everything off as a loss. Can you imagine? In a certain respect, however, it appears from the Torah's account that the idea of Shemitah and Yovel is not exactly suspension of ownership, but something little different. This is called a Copernican hipuch, inversion. It can be called the reinforcement of ownership. In other words, the reminding to all of us that God grants us the land on which we live. God grants that we can grow what we need to feed ourselves, but that God ultimately owns the land, not us. The bottom line, it is God, the creator of all, that determines these relationships, our responsibilities, and what it means that we are to supervise, serve, and guard the land simultaneously, or do along with the Alta or the Shamra. Abuse of any part of our totality can be reflected in so many other aspects of our lives. Conversely, following the laws and regulations of conservative and responsible stewardship as intended in the very beginning of our Torah can teach us much about humility, have us value all that there is, and not take our world and our resources for granted. So when we ask the question, what does Shemitah have to do with Har Sinai? Back to that cute little story we tell the kids. Why was the Torah given in Har Sinai? It was the smallest of all the mountains. It wasn't the biggest. It wasn't the prettiest. It wasn't the most lush. And the answer is precisely because of its humility and its humble nature. That's where Torah was given. That is what we're supposed to remember in our relationship to our land. We only are allowed to supervise, to rule it, if we understand that we must work it, we must guard it, we must maintain it, and we must distribute its produce responsibly. This is where the Torah teaches us so much about humility, having us value what is there, and not take our world and its resources for granted. Most importantly, we are to be reminded of our responsibilities to Ribono Shel Olam, who bequeathed all upon us. Shabbat Shalom. Use your day of rest well. Make sure all benefit from it, and allow your land to rest too. Lehitraot.